We soon discovered on our first morning in Boston that it was not going to be hard to like what we'd found. The people, scenery, and of course the autumn colours all played their part. Our itinerary allowed us one day in Boston before we headed north. With so much to see and learn about, the best way was to follow the Freedom Trail. The pathway, mapped out in red bricks in the pavement, guides visitors through the sites that speak of the past, starting on Boston Common and ending at Charlestown. The Common is significant in Boston's history because it's the place where angry colonials gathered and where the British Army encamped during the 1775–76 occupation. The Common is overlooked by the rather magnificent State House, the cornerstone of which was laid in 1798 by Samuel Adams, who was leader of the Massachusetts Radicals and much involved in the infamous Tea Party protests. The building is still used as the state legislature, but we only had a cursory inspection before we entered and were warmly welcomed. Next on the trail is the King's Chapel, built in 1749 for the first Anglican congregation. The chapel was a stronghold of loyalist opposition, many of whom eventually returned to England. For those who remained, a burial ground was established next to the church, which houses amongst others the remains of John Winthrop, the colony's first governor. This old market building, Faneuil Hall, dates from 1742. Town meetings were held here in 1764, where Samuel Adams and others led cries of protest against the imposition of taxes. Although the inn at the end of this street is called the Green Dragon, it's not the original. That dated from 1701 and was at one time the headquarters of the Revolution. The Boston Tea Party was planned there, and Paul Revere was sent from it on his famous ride to Lexington. The provenance of this Green Dragon is somewhat more in doubt, but it is at least close to Paul Revere's house. Boston's oldest residential neighbourhood, the North End, includes the Paul Revere House. Downtown Boston's oldest residence was built in about 1680. Paul Revere and his family owned and occupied it most of the time from 1770 to 1800. Paul Revere was born in 1735 and was a very successful businessman, in addition to being a key member of the Boston Safety Committee. It was in this role that he rode to Lexington and Concord on the 18th of April 1775 to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock of the impending arrival of 700 British troops to arrest them. Such a large force was, of course, far in excess of that which was really needed, but they had another purpose. That was to seize the large quantity of munitions the rebels had accumulated at Concord. This whole area is filled with references to both Revere and the Revolution. Not only does he have his own statue, but this street is one of the most photographed in the whole city. Across the Charlestown Bridge lies the naval dockyard. The colonial navy was no match for the British ships, but by 1800 several shipyards had been created. Lying at Pier 1, where you can see the ship now, is the USS Constitution, probably one of the most important ships in US history. She was completed in 1797. In the War of 1812, though, she was nicknamed Old Ironsides for the resilience of her oak frames against enemy cannon fire, the enemy of course being the British.
They are pumps. You know what kind of pumps.
By now we were at the further reaches of the Freedom Trail, and the hotel felt some way off, but fortunately there was a ferry to help shorten the journey back. Even with the help of the Freedom Trail, we'd really only scratched the surface of what Boston has to offer, but it had been a good start. The next day we collected our car and headed north briefly for New Hampshire and then to Freeport in Maine. After a short diversion to Kennebunk, we reached Freeport by mid-afternoon. The hotel you see here was really lovely, and Freeport is a fascinating place as well as being a shopping destination of some note, due largely to L.L. Bean, who some claim invented retailing due to the success and design of a truly waterproof boot. Next morning we headed west to New Hampshire and Jackson, hoping at last to start and see the fall colours.
Continue on Hurricane Mountain Road.
By now we were soaking up the scenery and the autumn colours. The mountain road was narrow but beautifully surfaced, making the hill climbing easy and the descents a joy with hardly any traffic to be seen. After the morning's drive, Hurricane Mountain Highway was our gateway to North Conway, where there is a preserved railway. Fortunately, we arrived in time to take the afternoon steam service to Conway, about 30 minutes away. Although the afternoon train arrived behind a heritage diesel, that was soon changed to steam, which was an added bonus for us. On a beautiful day, it was no surprise that the service was packed with tourists and other guests, dogs, who wanted to enjoy the mountain scenery. The trip was over rather too quickly, but we still needed to find our hotel at Jackson, home for the next 2 nights. The Christmas Farm Hotel was smaller than some we stayed in, but well located as a base for the next day's trip to Mount Washington. One of the defining features of New England are its covered bridges. There are more than 100, most of which were built between 1825 and 1875. This one's called the Honeymoon Bridge, straddling the Ellis River, constructed in 1876. As we were not due to travel on the Cog Railway until the afternoon, we headed north from Jackson, which as it turned out was a great decision, because the stunning drive through the White Mountains was absolutely full of colour. One of the most popular attractions in the area are the Glen Ellis Falls, just south of Gorham. The drop is 64 feet. It's an easy walk down, but a little harder on the way back. While we saw plenty of autumn colours elsewhere, the brilliant sun and the scenery of the White Mountains made for an absolutely superb day, capped off by the trip up Mount Washington on the Cog Railway. In retrospect, however, it was probably the best day of the whole trip, and that's setting a very high threshold indeed. By early afternoon we arrived at the railway, thankful for the clear skies, and hoping we would get good views from the top of the mountain. At 6,280 feet, we'd come prepared for what the weather may do. Since the mountain holds the record for the Northern Hemisphere's highest recorded wind speed, 231 miles an hour, anything might happen. The railway was the first cog railway in the world. Building began in 1866 and first operated in 1869. These days the single coach is usually propelled by an eco-friendly diesel, except for two trains, one in the morning and another in the afternoon, which use steam propulsion. The trip takes about 3 hours, and we'd fortunately booked our tickets well in advance, so we were assured of our seats. To maximise the capacity of the single line, it has a number of passing places, which allows the diesels on their coaches to provide an almost continuous service. On a clear day like the one we had, the views were superb, getting better and better the higher we went. You could see both Canada and the coast. However, despite the warm sunshine at the base, at 6,000 feet, the wind cut through you like a knife. It was 5 o'clock by the time we left. The light was going fast, but we did have some time left for a few more landscape shots, and finally a sun-setting scene on the way down. Having spent 2 very pleasant nights at Jackson, it was time to move on. First west to Lincoln and then north to Stowe. But first of all we were going to Highway 112, the Kancamagus Highway, rated as one of the top routes in North America for the autumn colours. With the stunning scenery we could see through the windscreen, it was hard to avoid stopping regularly on this route, as there are lots of lookouts and waterfalls on the swift river. A few miles further on down the highway, we found Saturday Falls. That provided another opportunity for some walking through the woods to find the beautiful location of the falls themselves. This overlook was only a few miles further on from the falls, but it was too good to pass by, and thank goodness we didn't. The view was superb. As we dropped down to Lincoln, the colours of the mountainside certainly gave evidence to the claims made for this route, and the laybys were full of leaf peepers enjoying the spectacle. But once we got to Lincoln, we'd be heading north, towards Stowe, but stopping off at Flume Gorge. The Flume, which is part of the Franconia Notch State Park, was originally formed 200 million years ago. It's still eroding and evolving today, but now there's a 2-mile trail to the falls, which doesn't sound too much, but the terrain is such that it still takes about an hour and a half to get there. In any case, it's too beautiful to rush. However you choose to see it, Flume Gorge is a beautiful place, well worth the 2 hours that we spent enjoying its exploration. Now, if I'm honest, I have to admit that the overnight stop at the lodge at Spruce Peak was a bit disappointing, in that the heavy rain and low cloud prevented us enjoying the scenery as we would have liked. But Stowe itself was a nice town, and a free tour and tasting at Ben & Jerry's helped us along, before we headed south to Woodstock. Getting on to Interstate 89 was fine. Getting off it was easy, but getting to Woodstock was a challenge. At this point, having followed the sat-nav instructions, we were actually lost, but the drive was rather beautiful, so we really didn't mind. With the help of a local resident and a local artist who was preparing some sculpture in his front garden, as well as Google Maps, we soon got back on track to what we both thought was our favourite place on the whole tour. The hotel was beautiful, the town delightful, and the people very welcoming. We'd planned to stay 2 nights here, so we had plenty of chance to enjoy what the town had to offer, not least the most wonderful general store, and Aladdin's cave of almost anything you would want or need. The store dates from 1886, started by Frank Henry Gillingham. It's still located in the original building, and a visit to this shop is like a step back in time to a more gentle period, which fits Woodstock beautifully. Another favourite was the Mountain Creamery, where we went for breakfast on both days. The pancakes and blueberries were delicious. Although the weather was a bit damp and chilly, it wasn't going to spoil the morning as we walked out of town. We're going to explore the Marsh Billings Rockefeller Mansion, as well as the associated farm and museum. In fact, the farm was just a short stroll from the town, and brings together both animals, farmhouse, and a comprehensive farm museum. The farmhouse for George Aitken, the then manager, dates from 1890 and sits atop the creamery and icehouse. It was considered state-of-the-art at the time, with hot running water, heating and an indoor bathroom. Clearly Billings was a very progressive owner. The mansion, which is literally just across the road from the farm and museum, was built by Charles Marsh in 1805 and was subsequently bought by Cornelius Billings, who was an industrialist, philanthropist and collector in 1869. It then passed to Lawrence Rockefeller in 1954, and it is in their style that it remains today. The rooms are, as you might expect, large and elaborately furnished, but by modern tastes rather dark. The house was absolutely crammed with history, ably described by our guide. Even on a wet day, though, the gardens were still colourful, with shades of autumn everywhere. The estate has a fully working farm, with over 70 Jersey cows, flocks of Southdown sheep, pigs, horses, chickens and oxen, which make up a very complete experience indeed. The young calves, however, were particularly attractive. The museum is excellent and beautifully presented. Though there is so much to see, it's not surprising that it was popular with school groups, absorbing the history. Next morning, much as we would like to have stayed longer, we're on the road again, south this time to Stockbridge and the Berkshires. It was about 160 miles to Stockbridge, but the interstate journey was very straightforward, taking us to the Red Lion Inn as our base for the night. The hotel is as impressive on the inside as it is on the outside. It has quite a history dating back to 1773, though it was unfortunately totally destroyed by fire in 1896. It was rebuilt and has remained substantially unchanged since the 1960s. Not far from Stockbridge is the Flume Gorge, which is self-styled as Vermont's Little Grand Canyon. En route we stopped off at Simon Pearce's glass-blowing factory, which also gave us the opportunity to see another of the covered bridges, which was right outside the factory. It carries the US Route 4 over the Ottauquechee River. Built in 1911, it is Vermont's oldest surviving steel arch bridge. The gorge itself is only a few miles away from the village and can be observed from a road bridge 168 feet above the river. If you have the time, I'm told it's a stimulating walk to the river following one of the many trails. Although the bridge has high wire sides, the authorities have thoughtfully made cutouts in the wire to help photographers. These botanical gardens were only a short distance away from the hotel, covering 20 acres, containing over 3,000 species and varieties. They were established in 1934. Despite the fact it was still very grey when we arrived, it made for a pleasant walk before setting off on the next leg of our journey, to Mystic, in yet another of the New England states, Connecticut. Mystic proved to be a great place for an overnight stop on our way towards Hyannis. The name is derived from the Indian language, Missitook, describing the water on which the village stands. Apart from its architecture and the bascule lifting bridge, the village is home to the nation's largest maritime museum, and also at the time of our visit, an exhibition by John Mallord William Turner, organised in conjunction with the Tate Gallery in London. Much to our surprise, we also found the replica of the Mayflower in dock, part way through its restoration project, due for completion in 2020. The Mystic scale model was a great way to see and hear about the history of Mystic in 1870, when shipbuilding was at its peak.
And a new day begins as the village of Mystic builds ships that will voyage to the corners of the globe. Between 1850 and 1870, the period this model represents, this little sea community produced a greater tonnage of ships and steamers than any place of equal size in America. Air was filled with the sounds of wooden ships under construction.
Close by was the Joseph Conrad, built in Copenhagen in 1882 as a training ship. Run down by a British freighter in 1905, it was raised and repaired to resume her career. The recreated seafaring village was a source of fascination and stunningly presented, with shops and buildings transported here from locations around New England. The Charles W. Morgan is the last of an American whaling fleet that once numbered more than 2,700 vessels. Built and launched in 1841, she made 37 voyages over an 80-year career and is now regarded as the flagship of the museum. Having walked round the exhibitions, we also took advantage of the opportunity to see them from the water, to give a totally different perspective. The harbour boat trip gave us a really good opportunity to get up close to the Bascule Bridge. It was built in 1922, and in this busy little port is opened every hour to let boats and shipping through. We couldn't go aboard Mayflower whilst it's being refitted, but we did get close to it, and also to a replica Viking longboat sailed here all the way from Norway. In many ways it was a shame we had to move on, but our next destination, Newport, was waiting, actually full of car enthusiasts, attending a concours d'élégance taking place over the weekend. As we were soon to learn, Newport is a place of some considerable wealth, not just because of the cars, but the harbour was full of yachts and powerboats, not to mention the real estate surrounding it. Prior to our arrival, we'd never heard of the Newport mansions. Fortunately, they were recommended to us. They're now managed by the Preservation Society of Newport County, and several are open to the public. We chose to visit two, the Breakers and the Marble House. The Breakers gets its name after the waves constantly crashing against the cliffs below. It's a stunning jewel of the New York Central Railroad fortune of Cornelius Vanderbilt. The 13-acre estate overlooks the Atlantic Ocean, and on this day was also playing host to the Concours d'Élégance. Despite its size, it was built within just 2 years, 1893 to 95, and cost approximately $7 million. It contains 70 rooms, and Vanderbilt's great-grandchildren still live on the 3rd floor. As might be expected, each room is filled with fabulous works of art and beautiful objects from across the world. The Breakers is regarded as the crown jewel of the cottages. This has nothing to do with size, but because they were simply used only for the summer. The views from the 1st floor were stunning, enhanced of course by the gathering of such beautiful cars parked on the lawn. The Marble House was also built by a member of the Vanderbilt family, the grandson of Cornelius. It took place between 1888 to 1892. It was designed by an architect called Richard Hunt, who had taken inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles. It was reputed to have cost $11 million, spent mostly on the amount of marble used in its construction. When it was finished, Cornelius gave it to his wife for her 39th birthday present. Despite appearances, the marble house is smaller than the breakers. The building is U-shaped and spread over 4 levels, with the kitchen and service levels in the basement. Once you've looked round inside the house, there's plenty to see outside, with refreshments in the China house and stunning views along the coast. Before moving on to our last destination of the tour, at Hyannis, we took a drive round the coastal headland to Fort Adams. It's a former US Army post, originally built in 1799, named after President John Adams. This version of the fort dates from 1824, after the War of 1812 against the British. On the day we arrived, this magnificent sailing ship was in port. It's an ocean-going sailing school, named after Oliver Hazard Perry, a naval officer who became a hero when he defeated a squadron of British ships in the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. Hyannis, apart from being an interesting and busy port, is also one of the places where tourists can take trips to see whales off Cape Cod. It's also a near neighbour to Hyannis Port, well known as the home of members of the Kennedy family over many decades. Regrettably, our plans to go whale watching got cancelled at the last moment due to bad weather, so we decided to drive ourselves up Cape Cod to Provincetown. The Highland Light is one of several protecting shipping sailing round Cape Cod. This one was built in 1857 and is the oldest on the peninsula. It's still operational but is not in its original position. Coastal erosion placed it in great danger, so the whole structure was moved back 450 feet in 1996. If we couldn't watch whales, we could still walk on the beach. It was cold and a bit bleak, but wild and beautiful, and the place where the pilgrims first landed to replenish their supplies on the 11th of November 1620. And so after 2 weeks our last day had arrived, but we had an opportunity for one last trip out of Hyannis Harbour to Hyannis Port. Apart from being an opportunity to see the port, we'd also see where the Kennedys still live, and where Jack Kennedy spent so much time when he was president. Hyannis has a very good museum dedicated to him and his family, which has lost none of its poignancy after all these years. It was impossible after the boat trip and visiting the museum not to reflect on what might have been if things had worked out differently for the family. In front of us now is the JFK Memorial, overlooking the bay where he sailed regularly when he was at Hyannis. The water around Hyannis is very shallow in some places, so boats have to be very careful when they're exiting. Not quite so critical for us, because the draft is quite shallow, but for boats going to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, it's a different story. A number of key sites were pointed out for us, but I've identified 2 in particular, that for President Kennedy, and to its left, the house with the 3 white roofs belonged to the late Senator Edward Kennedy. With the trip nearly over, we're returning to Hyannis, but we can reflect on a wonderful time. 14 days, 6 states, and by the time we return to Boston, nearly 1,200 miles. New England has so much to offer. This video is only an appetizer, but hopefully it gives a taste of the scale and variety of what awaits the visitor to New England.